Chapter 72 of the Old Curiosity Shop. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. The Old Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens. Chapter 72. When the morning came, and they could speak more calmly on the subject of their grief, they heard how her life had closed. She had been dead 2 days. They were all about her at the time, knowing that the end was drawing on. She died soon after daybreak. They had read and talked to her in the earlier portion of the night, but as the hours crept on, she sunk to sleep. They could tell by what she faintly uttered in her dreams that they were of her journeyings with the old man. They were of no painful scenes, but of people who had helped and used them kindly, for she often said, "God bless you," with great fervour. Waking, she never wandered in her mind but once, and that was a beautiful music which she said was in the air. God knows, it may have been. Opening her eyes at last from a very quiet sleep, she begged that they would kiss her once again. That done, she turned to the old man with a lovely smile upon her face, such, they said, as they had never seen, and never could forget, and clung with both her arms about his neck. They did not know that she was dead at first. She had spoken very often of the two sisters, who, she said, were like dear friends to her. She wished they could be told how much she thought about them, and how she had watched them as they walked together by the river side at night. She would like to see poor Kit, she had often said of late. She wished there was somebody to take her love to Kit. And even then, she never thought or spoke about him, but with something of her old, clear, merry laugh. For the rest, she had never murmured or complained, but with a quiet mind and manner quite unaltered, save that she every day became more earnest and more grateful to them, faded like the light upon a summer's evening. The child, who had been her little friend, came there almost as soon as it was day, with an offering of dried flowers, which he begged them to lay upon her breast. It was he who had come to the window overnight and spoken to the sexton, and they saw in the snow traces of small feet where he had been lingering near the room in which she lay, before he went to bed. He had a fancy, it seemed, that they had left her there alone, and could not bear the thought. He told them of his dream again, and that it was of her being restored to them, just as she used to be. He begged hard to see her, saying that he would be very quiet, and that they need not fear his being alarmed, for he had sat alone by his young brother all day long when he was dead, and had felt glad to be so near him. They let him have his wish, and indeed he kept his word, and was, in his childish way, a lesson to them all. After that time, the old man had not spoken once, except to her, or stirred from the bedside. But when he saw her little favourite, he was moved, as they had not seen him yet, and made as though he would have him come nearer. Then, pointing to the bed, he burst into tears for the first time, and they who stood by, knowing that the sight of this child had done him good, left them alone together. Soothing him with his artless talk of her, the child persuaded him to take some rest, to walk abroad, to do almost as he desired him. And when the day came on, which must remove her in her earthly shape from earthly eyes for ever, he led him away, that he might not know when she was taken from him. They were to gather fresh leaves and berries for her bed. It was Sunday, a bright, clear, wintry afternoon, and as they traversed the village street, those who were walking in their path drew back to make way for them, and gave them a softened greeting. Some shook the old man kindly by the hand, some stood uncovered while he tottered by, and many cried, "God help him," as he passed along. "Neighbour," said the old man, stopping at the cottage where his young guide's mother dwelt, "how is it that the folks are nearly all in black to-day? I have seen a mourning ribbon or a piece of crape on almost every one." She could not tell, the woman said. "Why, you yourself, you wear the colour too,"
he said. "Windows are closed that never used to be by day. What does this mean?"
Again the woman said she could not tell.
"We must go back," said the old man hurriedly. "We must see what this is."
"No, no," cried the child, detaining him. "Remember what you promised. Our way is to the old green lane, where she and I so often were, and where you found us more than once, making those garlands for a garden. Do not turn back."
"Where is she now?" said the old man. "Tell me that."
"Do you not know?" returned the child. "Did we not leave her but just now?"
True, it was her we left, was it?"
He pressed his hand upon his brow, looked vacantly round, and as if impelled by a sudden thought, crossed the road and entered the sexton's house. He and his deaf assistant were sitting before the fire. Both rose up on seeing who it was. The child made a hasty sign to them with his hand. It was the action of an instant, but that and the old man's look were quite enough.
Do you bury anyone today?" he said eagerly.
No. Who should we bury, sir?" returned the sexton.
"Aye, who indeed? I say with you, who indeed?"
"It is a holiday with us, good sir," returned the sexton mildly. "We have no work to do today."
"Why, then, I'll go where you will," said the old man, turning to the child. "You're sure of what you tell me? You would not deceive me? I am changed, even in the little time since you last saw me."
"Go thy ways with him, sir,"
cried the sexton, "and heaven be with ye both." "I am quite ready," said the old man meekly. "Come, boy, come," and so submitted to be led away. And now the bell she had so often heard, by night and day, and listened to with solemn pleasure, almost as a living voice, rung its remorseless toll for her, so young, so beautiful, so good. Decrepit age, and vigorous life, and blooming youth, and helpless infancy, poured forth, on crutches, in the pride of strength and health, in the full blush of promise, in the mere dawn of life, to gather round her tomb. Old men were there, whose eyes were dim and senses failing, grandmothers who might have died 10 years ago and still been old, the deaf, the blind, the lame, the palsied, the living dead in many shapes and forms, to see the closing of that early grave. What was the death it would shut in, to that which still could crawl and creep above it? Along the crowded path they bore her now, pure as the newly fallen snow that covered it, whose day on earth had been as fleeting. Under the porch, where she had sat when heaven in its mercy brought her to that peaceful spot, she passed again, and the old church received her in its quiet shade. They carried her to one old nook, where she had many and many a time sat musing, and laid their burden softly on the pavement. The light streamed on it through the coloured window, a window where the boughs of trees were ever rustling in the summer, and where the birds sang sweetly all day long. With every breath of air that stirred among those branches in the sunshine, some trembling, changing light would fall upon her grave. Earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Many a young hand dropped in its little wreath, many a stifled sob was heard. Some, and they were not a few, knelt down. All were sincere and truthful in their sorrow. The service done, the mourners stood apart, and the villagers closed round to look into the grave before the pavement stone should be replaced. One called to mind how he had seen her sitting on that very spot, and how her book had fallen on her lap, and she was gazing with a pensive face upon the sky. Another told how he had wondered much that one so delicate as she should be so bold, how she had never feared to enter the church alone at night,
but had loved to linger there when all was quiet, and even to climb the tower stair with no more light than that of the moon rays stealing through the loopholes in the thick old wall. A whisper went about among the oldest that she had seen and talked with angels, and when they called to mind how she had looked and spoken, and her early death, some thought it might be so indeed. Thus, coming to the grave in little knots, and glancing down, and giving place to others, and falling off in whispering groups of 3 or 4, the church was cleared in time, of all but the sexton and the mourning friends. They saw the vault covered, and the stone fixed down. Then, when the dusk of evening had come on, and not a sound disturbed the sacred stillness of the place, when the bright moon poured in her light on tomb and monument, on pillar, wall, and arch, and most of all, it seemed to them, upon her quiet grave. In that calm time, when outward things and inward thoughts teem with assurances of immortality, and worldly hopes and fears are humbled in the dust before them, then, with tranquil and submissive hearts, they turned away, and left the child with God. Oh, it is hard to take to heart the lesson that such deaths will teach, but let no man reject it, for it is one that all must learn, and is a mighty universal truth. When death strikes down the innocent and young, for every fragile form from which he lets the panting spirit free, 100 virtues rise, in shapes of mercy, charity, and love, to walk the world and bless it. Of every tear that sorrowing mortals shed on such green graves, some good is born, some gentler nature comes. In the destroyer's steps there spring up bright creations that defy his power, and his dark path becomes a way of light to heaven. It was late when the old man came home. The boy had led him to his own dwelling, under some pretence, on their way back, and, rendered drowsy by his long ramble and late want of rest, he had sunk into a deep sleep by the fireside. He was perfectly exhausted, and they were careful not to rouse him. The slumber held him a long time, and when he at length awoke, the moon was shining. The younger brother, uneasy at his protracted absence, was watching at the door for his coming, when he appeared in the pathway with his little guide. He advanced to meet them, and tenderly obliging the old man to lean upon his arm, conducted him with slow and trembling steps towards the house. He repaired to her chamber straight. Not finding what he had left there, he returned with distracted looks to the room in which they were assembled. From that he rushed into the schoolmaster's cottage, calling her name. They followed close upon him, and when he had vainly searched it, brought him home. With such persuasive words as pity and affection could suggest, they prevailed upon him to sit among them and hear what they should tell him. Then, endeavouring by every little artifice to prepare his mind for what must come, and dwelling with many fervent words upon the happy lot to which he had been removed, they told him at last the truth. The moment it had passed their lips, he fell down among them like a murdered man. For many hours they had little hope of his surviving, but grief is strong, and he recovered. If there be any who have never known the blank that follows death, the weary void, the sense of desolation that will come upon the strongest minds, when something familiar and beloved is missed at every turn, the connection between inanimate and senseless things and the object of recollection, when every household god becomes a monument, and every room a grave. If there be any who have not known this, and proved it by their own experience, they can never faintly guess how, for many days, the old man pined and moped away the time, and wandered here and there as seeking something, and had no comfort. Whatever power of thought or memory he retained, was all bound up in her. He never understood, or seemed to care to understand, about his brother. To every endearment and attention he continued listless. If they spoke to him on this or any other theme, save one, he would hear them patiently for a while, then turn away, and go on seeking as before. On that one theme, which was in his and all their minds, it was impossible to touch. Dead, he could not hear or bear the word. The slightest hint of it would throw him into a paroxysm, like that he had when it was first spoken. In what hope he lived, no man could tell, but that he had some hope of finding her again, some faint and shadowy hope, deferred from day to day, and making him from day to day more sick and sore at heart, was plain to all. They bethought them of a removal from the scene of this last sorrow, of trying whether change of place would rouse or cheer him. His brother sought the advice of those who were accounted skilful in such matters, and they came and saw him. Some of the number stayed upon the spot, conversed with him when he would converse, and watched him as he wandered up and down, alone and silent. Move him where they might, they said, he would ever seek to get back there. His mind would run upon that spot. If they confined him closely, and kept a strict guard upon him, they might hold him prisoner, but if he could by any means escape, he would surely wander back to that place, or die upon the road. The boy, to whom he had submitted at first, had no longer any influence with him. At times he would suffer the child to walk by his side, or would even take such notice of his presence as giving him his hand, or would stop to kiss his cheek, or pat him on the head. At other times he would entreat him, not unkindly, to be gone, and would not brook him near. But, whether alone, or with this pliant friend, or with those who would have given him, at any cost or sacrifice, some consolation or some peace of mind, if happily the means could have been devised, he was at all times the same, with no love or care for anything in life, a broken-hearted man. At length they found one day that he had risen early, and, with his knapsack on his back, his staff in hand, her own straw hat, and little basket full of such things as she had been used to carry, was gone. As they were making ready to pursue him far and wide, a frightened schoolboy came who had seen him, but a moment before, sitting in the church, upon her grave, he said. They hastened there, and going softly to the door, espied him in the attitude of one who waited patiently. They did not disturb him then, but kept a watch upon him all that day. When it grew quite dark, he rose and returned home, and went to bed, murmuring to himself, "She will come tomorrow." Upon the morrow he was there again, from sunrise until night, and still at night he laid him down to rest, and murmured, "She will come tomorrow." And thenceforth, every day, and all day long, he waited at her grave for her. How many pictures of new journeys over pleasant country, of resting places under the free broad sky, of rambles in the fields and woods and paths not often trodden, how many tones of that one well-remembered voice, how many glimpses of the form, the fluttering dress, the hair that waved so gaily in the wind, how many visions of what had been, and what he hoped was yet to be, rose up before him in the old, dull, silent church. He never told them what he thought, or where he went. He would sit with them at night, pondering with a secret satisfaction, they could see, upon the flight that he and she would take before night came again. And still they would hear him whisper in his prayers, "Lord, let her come tomorrow." The last time was on a genial day in spring. He did not return at the usual hour, and they went to seek him. He was lying dead upon the stone. They laid him by the side of her whom he had loved so well, and, in the church where they had often prayed and mused and lingered hand in hand, the child and the old man slept together. End of chapter 72. Chapter 73 of the Old Curiosity Shop. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. The Old Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens. Chapter 73. The magic reel, which, rolling on before, has led the chronicler thus far, now slackens in its pace and stops. It lies before the goal. The pursuit is at an end. It remains but to dismiss the leaders of the little crowd who have borne us company upon the road, and so to close the journey. Foremost among them, smooth Sampson Brass and Sally, arm in arm, claim our polite attention. Mr Sampson, then, being detained, as already has been shown, by the justice upon whom he called, and being so strongly pressed to protract his stay that he could by no means refuse, remained under his protection for a considerable time, during which the great attention of his entertainer kept him so extremely close that he was quite lost to society, and never even went abroad for exercise, saving into a small paved yard. So well, indeed, was his modest and retiring temper understood by those with whom he had to deal, and so jealous were they of his absence, that they required a kind of friendly bond to be entered into by two substantial housekeepers, in the sum of £1,500 apiece, before they would suffer him to quit their hospitable roof, doubting, it appeared, that he would return, if once let loose, on any other terms. Mr Brass, struck with the humour of this jest, and carrying out its spirit to the utmost, sought from his wide connection a pair of friends whose joint possessions fell some halfpence short of 15 pence, and proffered them as bail, for that was the merry word agreed upon both sides. These gentlemen being rejected after 24 hours' pleasantry, Mr Brass consented to remain, and did remain, until a club of choice spirits, called a grand jury, who were in the joke, summoned him to trial before 12 other wags for perjury and fraud, who in their turn found him guilty with a most facetious joy. Nay, the very populace entered into the whim, and when Mr Brass was moving in a hackney coach towards the building where these wags assembled, saluted him with rotten eggs and carcasses of kittens, and feigned to wish to tear him into shreds, which greatly increased the comicality of the thing, and made him relish it the more, no doubt. To work this sportive vein still further, Mr Brass, by his counsel, moved in arrest of judgment that he had been led to criminate himself, by assurances of safety and promises of pardon, and claimed the leniency which the law extends to such confiding natures as are thus deluded. After solemn argument, this point, with others of a technical nature whose humorous extravagance it would be difficult to exaggerate, was referred to the judges for their decision, Sampson being meantime removed to his former quarters. Finally, some of the points were given in Sampson's favour, and some against him, and the upshot was that, instead of being desired to travel for a time in foreign parts, he was permitted to grace the mother country under certain insignificant restrictions. These were, that he should, for a term of years, reside in a spacious mansion, where several other gentlemen were lodged and boarded at the public charge, who went, clad in a sober uniform of grey turned up with yellow, had their hair cut extremely short, and chiefly lived on gruel and light soup. It was also required of him that he should partake of their exercise of constantly ascending an endless flight of stairs, and, lest his legs, unused to such exertion, should be weakened by it, that he should wear upon one ankle an amulet or charm of iron. These conditions being arranged, he was removed one evening to his new abode, and enjoyed, in common with 9 other gentlemen and 2 ladies, the privilege of being taken to his place of retirement in one of royalty's own carriages. Over and above these trifling penalties, his name was erased and blotted out from the roll of attorneys, which erasure has been always held in these latter times to be a great degradation and reproach, and to imply the commission of some amazing villainy, as indeed it would seem to be the case, when so many worthless names remain among its better records, unmolested. Of Sally Brass, conflicting rumours went abroad. Some said with confidence that she had gone down to the docks in male attire, and had become a female sailor. Others darkly whispered that she had enlisted as a private in the 2nd Regiment of Foot Guards, and had been seen in uniform, and on duty, to wit, leaning on her musket and looking out of a sentry-box in St. James's Park one evening. There were many such whispers as these in circulation, but the truth appears to be that, after the lapse of some 5 years, during which there is no direct evidence of her having been seen at all, 2 wretched people were more than once observed to crawl at dusk from the inmost recesses of St. Giles's, and to take their way along the streets with shuffling steps and cowering, shivering forms, looking into the roads and kennels as they went in search of refuse food or disregarded offal. These forms were never beheld but in those nights of cold and gloom, when the terrible spectres, who lie at all other times in the obscene hiding-places of London, in archways, dark vaults, and cellars, venture to creep into the streets, the embodied spirits of disease and vice and famine. It was whispered by those who should have known that these were Samson and his sister Sally, and to this day, it is said, they sometimes pass, on bad nights, in the same loathsome guise, close at the elbow of the shrinking passenger. The body of Quilp being found, though not until some days had elapsed, an inquest was held on it near the spot where it had been washed ashore. The general supposition was that he had committed suicide, and, this appearing to be favoured by all the circumstances of his death, the verdict was to that effect. He was left to be buried, with a stake through his heart, in the centre of 4 lonely roads. It was rumoured afterwards that this horrible and barbarous ceremony had been dispensed with, and that the remains had been secretly given up to Tom Scott. But even here opinion was divided, for some said Tom dug them up at midnight and carried them to a place indicated to him by the widow. It is probable that both these stories may have had their origin in the simple fact of Tom's shedding tears upon the inquest, which he certainly did, extraordinary as it may appear. He manifested besides a strong desire to assault the jury, and being restrained and conducted out of court, darkened its only window by standing on his head upon the sill, until he was dexterously tilted upon his feet again by a cautious beadle. Being cast upon the world by his master's death, he determined to go through it upon his head and hands, and accordingly began to tumble for his bread. Finding, however, his English birth an insurmountable obstacle to his advancement in this pursuit, notwithstanding that his art was in high repute and favour, he assumed the name of an Italian image lad, with whom he had become acquainted, and afterwards tumbled with extraordinary success and to overflowing audiences. Little Mrs Quilp never quite forgave herself the one deceit that lay so heavy on her conscience, and never spoke or thought of it but with bitter tears. Her husband had no relations, and she was rich. He had made no will, or she would probably have been poor. Having married the first time at her mother's instigation, she consulted in her second choice nobody but herself. It fell upon a smart young fellow enough, and as he made it a preliminary condition that Mrs Jiniwin should be thenceforth an out-pensioner, they lived together after marriage with no more than the average amount of quarrelling, and led a merry life upon the dead dwarf's money. Mr and Mrs Garland and Mr Abel went out as usual, except that there was a change in their household, as will be seen presently, and in due time the latter went into partnership with his friend the notary, on which occasion there was a dinner and a ball and great extent of dissipation. Unto this ball there happened to be invited the most bashful young lady that was ever seen, with whom Mr Abel happened to fall in love. How it happened, or how they found it out, or which of them first communicated the discovery to the other, nobody knows. But certain it is that in course of time they were married, and equally certain it is that they were the happiest of the happy, and no less certain it is that they deserved to be so. And it is pleasant to write down that they reared a family, because any propagation of goodness and benevolence is no small addition to the aristocracy of nature, and no small subject of rejoicing for mankind at large. The pony preserved his character for independence and principle down to the last moment of his life, which was an unusually long one, and caused him to be looked upon, indeed, as the very old pa of ponies. He often went to and fro with the little phaeton between Mr Garland's and his son's, and, as the old people and the young were frequently together, had a stable of his own at the new establishment, into which he would walk of himself with surprising dignity. He condescended to play with the children as they grew old enough to cultivate his friendship, and would run up and down the little paddock with them like a dog. But though he relaxed so far, and allowed them such small freedoms as caresses, or even to look at his shoes, or hang on by his tail, he never permitted any one of them to mount his back or drive him, thus showing that even their familiarity must have its limits, and that there were points between them far too serious for trifling. He was not unsusceptible of warm attachments in his later life, for when the good bachelor came to live with Mr Garland upon the clergyman's decease, he conceived a great friendship for him, and amiably submitted to be driven by his hands without the least resistance. He did no work for 2 or 3 years before he died, but lived in clover, and his last act, like a choleric old gentleman, was to kick his doctor. Mr Swiveller, recovering very slowly from his illness, and entering into the receipt of his annuity, bought for the Marchioness a handsome stock of clothes, and put her to school forthwith in redemption of the vow he had made upon his fevered bed. After casting about for some time for a name which should be worthy of her, he decided in favour of Sophronia Sphinx, as being euphonious and genteel, and furthermore indicative of mystery. Under this title the Marchioness repaired, in tears, to the school of his selection, from which, as she soon distanced all competitors, she was removed before the lapse of many quarters to one of a higher grade. It is but bare justice to Mr Swiveller to say that although the expenses of her education kept him in straitened circumstances for 6 years, he never slackened in his zeal, and always held himself sufficiently repaid by the accounts he heard, with great gravity, of her advancement, on his monthly visits to the governess, who looked upon him as a literary gentleman of eccentric habits, and of a most prodigious talent in quotation. In a word, Mr Swiveller kept the Marchioness at this establishment until she was, at a moderate guess, full 19 years of age, good-looking, clever, and good-humoured, when he began to consider seriously what was to be done next. On one of his periodical visits, while he was revolving this question in his mind, the Marchioness came down to him alone, looking more smiling and more fresh than ever. Then it occurred to him, but not for the first time, that if she would marry him, how comfortable they might be. So Richard asked her. Whatever she said, it wasn't no, and they were married in good earnest that day week, which gave Mr Swiveller frequent occasion to remark, at divers subsequent periods, that there had been a young lady saving up for him after all. A little cottage at Hampstead being to let, which had in its garden a smoking-box, the envy of the civilized world, they agreed to become its tenants, and, when the honeymoon was over, entered upon its occupation. To this retreat Mr Chuckster repaired regularly every Sunday to spend the day, usually beginning with breakfast, and here he was the great purveyor of general news and fashionable intelligence. For some years he continued a deadly foe to Kit, protesting that he had a better opinion of him when he was supposed to have stolen the £5 note than when he was shown to be perfectly free of the crime, inasmuch as his guilt would have had in it something daring and bold, whereas his innocence was but another proof of a sneaking and crafty disposition. By slow degrees, however, he was reconciled to him in the end, and even went so far as to honour him with his patronage, as one who had in some measure reformed, and was therefore to be forgiven. But he never forgot or pardoned that circumstance of the shilling, holding that if he had come back to get another, he would have done well enough, but that his returning to work out the former gift was a stain upon his moral character which no penitence or contrition could ever wash away. Mr Swiveller, having always been in some measure of a philosophic and reflective turn, grew immensely contemplative at times in the smoking-box, and was accustomed at such periods to debate in his own mind the mysterious question of Sophronia's parentage. Sophronia herself supposed she was an orphan, but Mr Swiveller, putting various slight circumstances together, often thought Miss Brass must know better than that, and having heard from his wife of her strange interview with Quilp, entertained sundry misgivings whether that person, in his lifetime, might not also have been able to solve the riddle had he chosen. These speculations, however, gave him no uneasiness, for Sophronia was ever a most cheerful, affectionate, and provident wife to him, and Dick, excepting for an occasional outbreak with Mr Chuckster, which he had the good sense rather to encourage than oppose, was to her an attached and domesticated husband, and they played many 100,000 games of cribbage together. And let it be added to Dick's honour that though we have called her Sophronia, he called her the Marchioness from first to last, and that upon every anniversary of the day on which he found her in his sick room, Mr Chuckster came to dinner, and there was great glorification. The gamblers, Isaac List and Jowl, with their trusty confederate Mr James Groves of unimpeachable memory, pursued their course with varying success, until the failure of a spirited enterprise in the way of their profession dispersed them in various directions, and caused their career to receive a sudden check from the long and strong arm of the law. This defeat had its origin in the untoward detection of a new associate, young Frederick Trent, who thus became the unconscious instrument of their punishment and his own. For the young man himself, he rioted abroad for a brief term, living by his wits, which means by the abuse of every faculty that worthily employed raises man above the beasts, and so degraded sinks him far below them. It was not long before his body was recognized by a stranger, who chanced to visit that hospital in Paris where the drowned are laid out to be owned, despite the bruises and disfigurements which were said to have been occasioned by some previous scuffle. But the stranger kept his own counsel until he returned home, and it was never claimed or cared for. The younger brother, or the single gentleman, for that designation is more familiar, would have drawn the poor schoolmaster from his lone retreat, and made him his companion and friend. But the humble village teacher was timid of venturing into the noisy world, and had become fond of his dwelling in the old churchyard. Calmly happy in his school, and in the spot, and in the attachment of her little mourner, he pursued his quiet course in peace, and was, through the righteous gratitude of his friend, let this brief mention suffice for that, a poor schoolmaster no more. That friend, single gentleman or younger brother, which you will, had at his heart a heavy sorrow, but it bred in him no misanthropy or monastic gloom. He went forth into the world, a lover of his kind. For a long, long time it was his chief delight to travel in the steps of the old man and the child, so far as he could trace them from her last narrative, to halt where they had halted, sympathize where they had suffered, and rejoice where they had been made glad. Those who had been kind to them did not escape his search. The sisters at the school, they who were her friends, because themselves so friendless, Mrs Jarley of the waxwork, Codlin, Short, he found them all, and trust me, the man who fed the furnace fire was not forgotten. Kit's story, having got abroad, raised him up a host of friends, and many offers of provision for his future life. He had no idea at first of ever quitting Mr Garland's service, but, after serious remonstrance and advice from that gentleman, began to contemplate the possibility of such a change being brought about in time. A good post was procured for him, with a rapidity which took away his breath, by some of the gentlemen who had believed him guilty of the offence laid to his charge, and who had acted upon that belief. Through the same kind agency, his mother was secured from want, and made quite happy. Thus, as Kit often said, his great misfortune turned out to be the source of all his subsequent prosperity. Did Kit live a single man all his days, or did he marry? Of course he married. And who should be his wife but Barbara? And the best of it was, he married so soon that little Jacob was an uncle before the calves of his legs, already mentioned in this history, had ever been encased in broadcloth pantaloons, though that was not quite the best either, for of necessity the baby was an uncle too. The delight of Kit's mother and of Barbara's mother upon the great occasion is past all telling. Finding they agreed so well on that, and on all other subjects, they took up their abode together, and were a most harmonious pair of friends from that time forth. And hadn't Astley's cause to bless itself for their all going together once a quarter to the pit, and didn't Kit's mother always say, when they painted the outside, that Kit's last treat had helped to do that, and wonder what the manager would feel if he but knew it as they passed his house. When Kit had children 6 and 7 years old, there was a Barbara among them, and a pretty Barbara she was. Nor was there wanting an exact facsimile and copy of little Jacob, as he appeared in those remote times when they taught him what oysters meant. Of course there was an Abel, own godson to the Mr Garland of that name, and there was a Dick, whom Mr Swiveller did especially favour. The little group would often gather round him of a night, and beg him to tell again that story of good Miss Nell who died. This Kit would do, and when they cried to hear it, wishing it longer too, he would teach them how she had gone to heaven, as all good people did, and how, if they were good like her, they might hope to be there too one day, and to see and know her as he had done when he was quite a boy. Then he would relate to them how needy he used to be, and how she had taught him what he was otherwise too poor to learn, and how the old man had been used to say, "She always laughs at Kit," at which they would brush away their tears and laugh themselves to think that she had done so, and be again quite merry. He sometimes took them to the street where she had lived, but new improvements had altered it so much, it was not like the same. The old house had been long ago pulled down, and a fine broad road was in its place. At first he would draw with his stick a square upon the ground to show them where it used to stand, but he soon became uncertain of the spot, and could only say it was thereabouts, he thought, and these alterations were confusing. Such are the changes which a few years bring about, and so do things pass away, like a tale that is told. End of chapter 73. End of The Old Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Website ACT No. 2 SC No. 3.com.